Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining another episode of Lowdown on Low Code. This is actually going to be a really cool one because we're actually going to switch. We've had a lot of a vendor perspective from the product side. Today, we're going to actually switch and start presenting the services side of how to become a great low code shop. And listen, if you've been enjoying Lowdown on Low Code, if you'd like to share this with some like-minded folks out there, go ahead, hit the like button, hit the share button, subscribe. We're so gratified to all of you for tuning in. We are forever surprised that people are willing to come in and listen to a bunch of boring old guys on a pretty, pretty mundane topic. So thank you so much. Hey. Today's guest is actually kind of interesting because there's a little story here about how some of this all came together. So I was at a conference down in Austin, Texas, a number of years ago with BP3, hosted by today's guest. And I was sitting at a big round table in the conference room and listening to a presentation from an RPA vendor. Who was espousing how we were all going to have our own bot that was going to be working for us all the time in the background. And I must have had a pretty skeptical look on my face. And some old codger at the table next to me said this was a load of BS. But he said it in a really cool English accent, so it sounded much better. So that was actually where I met Francis Carden for the first time at this conference. How are you, Francis? Good to see you.
I'm great. Thanks, Rob. Good to see you guys. And Scott, welcome.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so today's guest is the co-founder, former CEO of BP3, is now on the board of BP3. If you're not familiar with BP3, BP3 is I guess I wouldn't call you a boutique services firm, but you're not a mega services firm. You have extreme tight focus on process and process automation. You guys do that extraordinarily well. You've always done it extraordinarily well.
Mm-hmm.
You were always a leader in my waves. You, along with all the global SIs.
Right.
So welcome today, Scott Francis. How are you, Scott?
I'm doing well. And I until today, I didn't realize that's where you guys met.
Right at your conference.
At our own conference, which
we did, where I picked up this wonderful Yeti mug from your Driven conference, which was the same conference. Yes.
Well, Krista White, who ran marketing for us back then, would love, and when she sees us, she's going to love seeing that you've got that swag, because she was a big Yeti fan, and so we went all in on Yeti-based marketing, you might say.
Yeti-based marketing is a good thing to go all in on, right. as well as T-shirts, which last for a very long time. Absolutely. Hey, Scott, we always start this off in an interesting way. We always enjoy kind of getting to know people's background. How did you end up in this? How did you end up in technology, process in particular? What brought you here? What's your backstory?
Yeah, well, I went to high school in I'll start way back. High school, Gainesville, Florida, and I went to Stanford for college. My dad was a poli-sci professor. I had no designs other than getting my PhD and becoming a professor in poli-sci or econ or something along those lines. Sort of grew up arguing politics at the dinner table with Dad. So you can imagine, sort of my thought process going into college. And when I was there, I got to take great classes from folks like Krasner and Scott Sagan. And, there were other luminaries there in political science. And I loved econ and chemistry. I kind of loved every subject I got into. And but then I got my first computer science class, and the gratification of writing the solution to a problem and having it work, and that sort of feedback loop of learning just seemed so much more gratifying than sort of poli-sci. Like, well, let's set a policy in place, and 20 years from now, we could judge whether it was a good policy, right? Mm-hmm. And whether it worked. But good luck figuring that out in any kind of reasonable time frame. So that's kind of what gave me the bug for writing code and getting into tech. And so I majored in computer science in the end, and didn't get the PhD, much to my parents' chagrin, I'm sure. And then I came down to Austin to work in tech, and I thought I'd just be here a year or two and then run screaming back to the Bay Area in California. But, it turns out Austin's a pretty good place to live. And, in the mid 90s, maybe it wasn't as much fun to visit, but it was a great place to live. And I spent the first 7 years, in that job building software for sales processes, configuration software, pricing software, deploying that for big customers. I got to work with some great brands like Ford, but also lots of smaller companies in telecom and banking, and Nortel was another one. Anyway, it was a great job. But one of the interesting things is we spent all this time working on process and we never used the word process. We all thought of process as bureaucracy and an administrative overhead. We didn't think of it as the double yellow line down the middle of the road that keeps traffic moving, right, and increases throughput. But we were actually building sales process software, right? And when I went to work at Lombardi in 2003, I suddenly had a mental model to go with. Oh, that's what I was doing. I just didn't have the right words for it and the way to represent it. We didn't have a way to represent that process in software. We would just, we'd have note paper and write it down, and we'd write some code, and then that was the end of it, right? So it really was a kind of change in my thinking about the word process and what it means for business.
Hey, Scott, I don't want to divert too much here. What was the name of the sales configuration company you worked for?
That was a company called Trilogy.
Trilogy?
Yeah.
Did you by any chance know a guy named Harry Vonk?
Of course. He was my first boss. No kidding.
So Harry Vonk was my boss at Lotus in San Francisco.
Yeah.
And he left to go to Austin to work for Trilogy. So anyway, but we digress. But
they didn't have a UK operation, did they? Because there's a company called Trilogy back in the UK that was
they did. A good friend of mine, David Newton, was out there along with some other folks.
It wasn't RPL. Working there in the programming language, was it?
RPL? Configuration. It was configuration software.
Configuration. Right?
Yeah. Maybe there's another connection there. Jesus Christ, we all get connected, don't we?
I know it's crazy. Harry was one of my favorite people. He was an amazing guy to work for, an amazing person.
So. He was a great boss. I really missed working for him. All right, Scott, let's go. Francis, let's get back to the podcast.
Yeah, let's get back. I skipped over my own intro, but it's good because there's such a common theme here, Scott. When we're talking to all these leaders of all these companies, it seems to be a lot of really cool. And Rob always makes a point of this. Great backstories. I mean, my backstory was my first. I left school at 15. Don't tell anybody, right? On a podcast.
Everybody knows now.
Everybody knows now. Yeah, but I became a car mechanic because I didn't know what I wanted to do. I mean, basically at school, nobody taught me to learn. It was interesting. They didn't tell me why I needed to learn something. And so I had no interest. And so when I left school, became a car mechanic, but realized there wasn't a lot of money in that, and ended up cleaning out the coffee cups in a training room of a computer company when I was about 17, and then taught myself programming. I mean, so I got into applications and development and stuff like that. But interesting, you talk about process. But before applications, we used to call things systems. We used to log into a system to get work done. We didn't call it an application. And somewhere in between then, way back when, 40 years ago, and now we call them applications. And log into a system, you log into an app, and that in itself. But my programming was in the 3GL world in a PIC operating system. For those old enough to remember PIC, and then there was mumps all around that. Yes, there is an operating system called mumps. Look it up if you don't believe me. But I worked on the PIC system, and then we ended up with a 4GL called Pro 4, which really introduced me. And I mentioned this a little bit when we spoke to Alan Trefler from Pega a couple of weeks ago, which was really the fourth generation, but of languages where you could build an application or a system without writing huge amounts of code, because it was before its time. And where we're at today is we now look at things holistically. We've got processes that need to get done. They were always processes before computing, right? The process of doing your ledgers or balancing the books in a bank, and night end, weekend, month end, quarter end, where you'd have to work like 3 or 4 days to get the quarter closed. All those processes then got computerized in the computerization era for all these different languages, but the 4GL world kind of like just went away because it was just easier to do in code. We had to do things that ran in a small amount of memory space on a small amount of disk space. Shit, I don't think we even had enough disk space to do any indexing back when I started programming. And so everything, you wanted to sort a very simple file. It took a week, right? Because there was no indexes. So if we look at your organization, though, and leap forward to where we're at today, because 4GLs to me is the kickstart of low code, right? It had a 30-year pause, if you like, although Alan would argue that there wasn't a pause there because he was doing this. But it was called low code when, in 2012, Rob, when you and Mr. Reimer were at Forrester?
Mr. Richardson and Mr. Reimer. No, okay. I did not. I was not involved in coining that term.
All right, I'm giving you credit where none is due, so that's fine. but low code came about, right, as a term. It's actually got my passion, as you know. And then we had RPA. I think we met when I had an RPA company. I never ever saw RPA beyond what it was, which was screen scraping, perhaps on steroids a little bit, but it was still automating as is processes. But leap forward where we're at today, and we look at these processes, they've been computerized for decades now. Are you seeing in your role, and you can certainly tell us a little bit more about BP3, but are you seeing this acceptance now that we've got to get out of our own way, that we can do so much more today, and low code is getting a new lease of life thanks to Gen AI, but we can do so much more today than we've ever been able to imagine in the past 40 years?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an awareness that problems that were previously too expensive or too daunting to solve are now within reach. And, I have this kind of, if you take the label low code away, right, and you just said, well, what if I could give you some software that made it easier to generate reports? Like, okay, well, that'd be useful, right? I'd take that. That would help me. And I remember when I worked at Lombardi, we had a moment in time where they released this new reporting framework that made it much easier to generate reports against our process data. And there was some concern amongst folks in the company that, like, would this eat into our services revenue generating reports for customers and building those? And I was running the technical services team there, and I said, no, we're going to do a lot more revenue writing reports now because it was too hard, right? And so the value of the report wasn't worth the effort to build it. But if the effort was 1/10 the effort, then there's a whole lot of reports that now make sense to write and build. And I think you're seeing that same sort of logic with the tools that are hitting the market, right, in terms of low code and AI and generative AI. There's just whole categories of problems that 5 years ago you'd say, well, it's just too hard to build it from scratch. I'm going to pass that over, or I'll use a packaged application that doesn't really fit my needs, and I'll figure out how to make it work. And now they can say, actually, let's just build the solution in-house or with help from outside experts, but let's build something we own that really reflects our business. Or let's extend the systems of record we already have, and we can do that in more flexible ways than we could 5 years ago. I use 5 years as you could say 10 years, 3 years. There's always a change, but I think 5 years is just long enough that you can kind of say, yeah, actually a lot's changed in 5 years.
Before I hand back to you, Rob, just a follow-up question on that, Scott.
Yeah.
So, we've had all these different terminologies to describe. Intelligent automation was probably the most common. Digital transformation. I think somebody said digital transformation is such an DX is so overused. We're going to go with intelligent automation or digital process automation, hyper automation, and then process. It just goes on, right? But the reality is, if we cut through that, it was always automating or trying to understand as is computerized systems that had been applied to, I'm going to say, legacy processes before computers, and then legacy processes after they were computerized. Do you think that there should be is it still to you, Dean, digital transformation, if you're going to go, you know what, let's take a step back and reimagine what the process would look like on a system today? And actually, throw away the baby with the bathwater, right? I mean, I don't know if that's just a British term, but anyway. So, because it was too expensive before. It really was. And people still say it is. But then there are organizations out there like Starling Bank that actually rebuilt a bank from ground zero and create a digital bank. So it is possible. And do you think, and are you seeing, whatever this term is, intelligent automation, digital transformation, whatever, and should there be a new term, but are you seeing the same thing?
I am, and I think it's really quite interesting because, a lot of this effort has been around automating and orchestrating, right? Those two things, right? How do I coordinate all this automation? How do I coordinate the people that are involved in my processes, the customers, the vendors, the systems, and information? And that coordination, if you do it right, gives you a lot of opportunities for automation and really improving efficiency. And I think actually that clean slate has gotten more common. It's happening more often. It was a real surprise, I would say, 6 or 7 years ago when we would run into a client who was like, no, we need to do this ourselves. Usually the situation was there wasn't a good offering for their industry or market segment or their function, or they were really in a sort of bind, right? Kind of a custom situation where, they're doing construction at scale, but they don't really have there's no on the market tool for them to go buy that would do what they're doing. That exception has started to become something that I see $100 million companies do rather than multi-billion dollar companies. And I mean, banks have been doing this they're sort of software engineering outfits with a veneer of finance for quite some time. And so I think it's no surprise that banks are in many ways leading the way on that, but it all happens behind
only some in
closed doors,
some
right?
of
Yeah.
them still they've still got the
Well, that's
baby
true.
bathwater and the old dirty bathwater as well.
Oh
With
gosh, we could tell you a story about setting up a bank account for analysis.tech, and
Oh yeah.
and I won't mention the bank that was FedExing paperwork back and forth and asking us to go to
Oh no.
notaries and things like that. So
Yeah.
we went to a digital bank and had a better
Right.
experience. Hey guys, I want to take just a quick moment and let the audience know a little bit about analysis.tech. If you like what you're hearing, if you want to engage further with myself or with Francis Carden or with John Reimer, former analyst, one of the co-inventors of the term low code, Dave Marcus, who's worked with a number of large and prominent firms, including K2 and UiPath, built their partner channel. Ryan Duguid, chief product officer at Nintex and later QuickBase. Andy Bartels, former chief economist with Forrester, now with analysis.tech. Hit us up at analysis.tech. We'd love to hear from you. We've got some great new research that we just released this week. So back to our regularly scheduled programming. Scott, right before the ad, you made a comment that I want to follow up on because
Sure.
I mentioned sort of the old codgers. Francis talks about himself and I as the two old guys in the Muppets show who are always
Right.
who are always in the
My
background.
favorite characters. Right.
And we were rolling our eyes around the future of everybody having an RPA bot that's working for them. I feel like we're in a similar hype cycle. One of the areas where this feels like it's getting, and it's very interesting, right? We absolutely agree that there's a lot of power coming out of what's happening with the application of AI to process. One of the areas that I think makes me a little uncomfortable is we're moving from this kind of concept of agents, agentic process automation to we're going to string these things together. They're going to orchestrate end-to-end processes.
Right.
And I'm like, well, this is starting to sound like we're never going to need BPM, digital process automation, anymore. We're going to have RPA with control towers. Malarkey never happened. What do you think in terms of orchestration, the importance of orchestration? I've always thought it was a critical component to an automation strategy. Is this going away anytime soon? If I'm making a bet right now as a CIO, am I continuing to make that bet on orchestration?
Well, I think the way I look at the positions that these software firms take on this stuff is trying to understand what are their capabilities and what does it look like to sell their own book, right? So I always want to know what is someone's bias coming in, not necessarily political bias, but their intellectual bias, right? Like, what do I have in my kit that I want to put to work? And also, what is the lens through which I see the world, right? And I'm upfront with people. We have a process lens at BP3. I have that lens when I look at the world. So I see things in terms of processes. I used to see them in terms of configuration, but I've evolved, you could say. And when you look at these companies, for the most part, the folks I see really pushing the agentic AI to just takes the place of process orchestration, and you just have the AI deciding how to string all this stuff together and do it all for you. Generally don't have strong process orchestration capabilities in their toolkit. So, and they don't have that as part of their lens for how they see the world, right? They see the world through a lens of automation, and they see AI as the next thing. And there isn't process in their sort of mental model, right? Or their stack of how the world ought to work, or their tech stack. And I think that's a missing element, and it causes them to make mistakes or misjudgments about how easily AI will, generally speaking, piece together your process for you, and how well that works. And also, I think you have to also think about the implications of AI running your process for you versus you defining your process and using AI within that context. I'll give an example. We worked with a utility company that was very concerned about rolling out Copilot, even though they loved it. We're like, but if we roll this out, how do we make sure that our team isn't inadvertently putting data out there that is proprietary to our clients, to ourselves, to the government, whatever it is, right? And how do we make sure we're not outing information we shouldn't be? And how do we make sure we're not ingesting information into our systems that we shouldn't be? Like they had legitimate concerns.
Yep.
And I think all of that makes sense when you're just putting a utility out there, like a capability like emailing, into the hands of all of your employees. The flip side of that is, well, if you're doing that in the context of a process, you're defining the inputs and the outputs that you need, and you're defining the systems you're integrating with and the context within the process in which it's shared. So you know what information you're sharing at that point, and the risk becomes much less because it's known, right? Unknown risk is scary. Known risk gives you a lot more comfort because then you can mitigate. You can plan for what data is shared and used. And that's just, I think, just one example of why process orchestration is kind of a critical element to making AI work for your business. But I think the other part is, I'm not sure you want it to be a black box, right? For AI to determine your process for you and then run it. And so you can imagine a world where it, says, well, I ingested these accounts payable invoice, like an email came in, it looks like invoices. So I ingested those invoices. I checked, they look like a vendor that's in our system. I put it into the accounts payable system and triggered payment. Well, how easy is it to fool that system and defraud the company and have it spend money without any checks and balances? I want that process to include, the controller looking at those payments, or the CFO looking at those payments and verify that those are correct. That not just that it's the right vendor, but that the amounts are correct, that they did indeed provide those services that we're paying for or products that we're paying for. All those things that, are a little harder for AI to figure out for you.
Agree wholeheartedly. And I think the combination of there's a great deal of power in these in what these things can do, but they do come with probabilistic outcomes, and oftentimes come with opacity in terms of why something was decided to do. And that can be mixed into a process through an orchestration engine, right? There are steps in the process where that could be very powerful, could save you a lot of time. You can mitigate the risk.
Absolutely.
And there are steps where you probably don't want to do that. So, to me, the role of the orchestration engine is critical for the foreseeable future. We finally came around to embracing this concept of orchestration after so long. And I think it makes all these technologies far more powerful. So, Francis,
I've been even more vocal on that, though, Rob, and I think you know this. So I am, number one, passionate about low code, no code. It's just, I've said this a number of times on my podcast. You know that, and anybody wants to question me on that, welcome to. But I've also had the same thing around orchestration. It's like, if you think about it, why wouldn't you orchestrate your work, even if it's good, bad, and ugly? You need to orchestrate it to know how it's done, even if the rules are not there. If you orchestrated it, you know where you're breaking the rules. You'll know where people are bypassing, some regulation or doing it in the wrong order. So, and I think this came about when I started to understand more about process mining, when that became hot a few years ago. I'm like, well, people are doing process mining because they don't know what their processes are, which is great for the market. Why the F don't you know what your processes are? It's just, you could just like, well, we don't know. What do you mean you don't know? This is why it's so hard to set up a bank account or to deal with a contact center when you're trying to get a new phone, because they don't. Anyway, so I am mega passionate. So it's good to hear you talk about that, Scott.
Hey, Francis, I'm sorry I have to interject, but because I think we've all been sitting in a room at some point in time trying to determine a process with a cross-organizational team, people from different parts of the organization and from different geographies. They never have the same process.
That's an excuse. But that's an excuse not to have orchestration. And I think that's the wrong excuse. I'm okay with you orchestrating good, bad, and ugly processes. That's my point. The people go, well, our process is different. So, so they just don't have orchestration. It's like, it's a big pull out the book and here's the manual, right?
Right.
Well, good luck getting people to do that on a Friday afternoon when they're getting home to want to go home and have a gin and tonic, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't happen in the real world.
But we have
Well,
explored this topic before, right?
Yeah.
With other guests, including practitioners,
Mhm.
including people who are
Mhm.
sitting in a marketing department. We had one guest who works
Yeah.
in a marketing department and says, look, there is value in understanding your processes. There is value in defining them. There is value in standardizing them. And ultimately, quite often, there is value in automating them. Not the least of which is once you automate it, it becomes consistent and auditable. So
Right.
so
But it is true to say that if we're going to go back to what we were discussing with Scott earlier, which is that we start, I'm going to say start from scratch. I don't know what we
Mhm.
really mean by that, but let's
Right.
just imagine for a moment we're all going to start a new business is going to be a bank. Well, start with figuring out what the process is going to look like and orchestrate it, right? Even if you're orchestrating nothing, it's just people doing manual work. Then you fill in the blanks and say, right, okay, this part of the orchestration is different for that team. But if you start without that, it quickly becomes this legacy spaghetti. You're like, oh, we'll throw that over to that group. They'll deal with that in that system. There's no connecting to this system. So I do think
Yeah.
because the technology exists today, to start again and throw away the old stuff, you build this from the bottom up. And that's the advantage of low code and building in a model, because most of these low code vendors have this built in. Not all of them, but many of them, Scott, right? They have it built in.
you're chomping at the bit here, Scott. I can
Yeah.
tell.
Yeah. Well, I think there are like two things come to mind that I learned from wiser people than me. Lance Gibbs, my co-founder, used to say, when people would tell him that we don't have a process for that, he would say, well, you do have a process. It might just be real bad. Right. So let's talk about what you're doing. Right. And we'd figure out what their process is.
Document it. Yeah. Oh, shit.
Right. Yeah. And then let's figure it out. The other thing is, if you have a process, but you don't put it in software, then it's not going to stick. So if you design a new process that's really good and you don't orchestrate it and put it in software into the systems that your team uses, then it will evolve and revert over time to some non-optimal state without you being aware of it, because all the process stuff is happening outside the software where you're not measuring it. And so I think that's a really important element. And that's something, like Phil Gilbert, from Lombardi and IBM days used to really harp on, that if you want to make it last, you got to put it in software. And I think that's really true.
Yeah.
And of course, want to use the right kind of software so you can evolve it over time. If you put it in software and the answer is SAP 1990s style, well, you've just poured concrete into your organization and you can't evolve. So you've got to also think about how you want your processes to evolve over time.
Hey, when the processes wander, Scott, isn't that usually just about the moment when the regulators show up and do an audit?
Yeah.
When they've wandered
It usually
in a
is.
direction you didn't know about?
Yeah.
But
Hey, guys,
the process is okay if it's documented and you know where they've gone and you build into it where they go. The problem is this: you don't have visibility to this stuff, so they turn to let's go look at the audit logs and all that stuff to try to figure out what happened. But in the new world, I think that leads on to this other thing around process, automation. Are we really seeing that? I think it's all aligning. Everything you've said, Scott, and that aligns with what Rob and I think as well around low code, is that it's okay to think about this again. Take a step back, think about it, because IT had to be involved in the process because they were writing all the stuff. Business would say, I need this, but they knew that when they gave it to IT, it's going to follow a different process anyway, because they were never aligned. But now are we seeing this true paradigm shift where business is driving the process, the orchestration, and the change?
Yeah, I think the way you phrased it, Francis, is really important, because too often what I hear is like business is going to write the systems and the applications, and I don't think that's the right target. When we use, I would argue at BP3 we've been using low code systems since we started in 2007, because most BPM software was effectively a stack that included low code, drag and drop your user interface, drag and drop your process. Yeah, whatever you want to call it, right?
Rules engines, there you go. Is a rules
right, rules engines, all that stuff, right? And they all gave you an ability to solve a problem without writing a lot of code that previously you would have written a lot of code for. And then if you did have to write code, it was in the context of some framework that made a lot of sense. But the thinking and the thought process, the ability to put a system together that works in production, works at scale, meets your security requirements, all of that good stuff, you still need software engineering minds involved. And so I think the right way to go about it is you want the business driving. You still want IT or technical people to deliver the systems that you want to use, right? And so I think that partnership, though, that has gotten a lot easier because, in the 90s, if you wanted to collaborate on enterprise software, you'd get together and talk about it. There'd be a big requirements document, 300 pages thick. If there was a process, we drew it on a whiteboard maybe, and maybe it stayed up for like a year while we're building the system. And all of that happens faster now. And that process you drew on the whiteboard, we should put that in BPMN, and it should be part of your running executable process, not this fiction that we refer back to. But actually, when you run into a problem in production, in your process, we go to the BPMN diagram in the software and find the spot where that code is running and say, okay, I understand as a technical person, I understand why this is breaking because of what's coming in, where it is in the process, and what it needs to do at this point. And then it can go about fixing it.
Hey Scott, I want to kind of close out here on a topic we've generally closed out on, and I think it relates to what you're just saying, which is the injection of new capabilities, new potential efficiencies, new potential effectiveness through AI. And you can look at this through the lens of, we can inject this in as a service into an existing process model in BPMN, or take a step back. But what are we looking at now in terms of AI? I try to strike the cautionary note on these things, but it is undoubtedly a sea change, and there are amazing things that are coming to bear every day. But what do you think? Where do you think we're going here?
Well, I think the first thing I would say with respect to AI is, on the optimistic or positive front, is it is amazing what you can do with various AI tools today versus what you could do 5 years ago or 10 years ago. Like, the progression is amazing, and there have been some really interesting breakthroughs. And so anything that I say that sounds negative should not take away from that, right? Like,
no, this isn't really Rob. Rob was busy today, so we just had him. He's fake news,
right? That's right. The Rob avatar, right? I mean, honestly, it's amazing, right? I never imagined in my lifetime I would see AI generate, such lifelike videos or, pictures and audio. And I mean, it just does amazing stuff. So that's sort of part one. Part two is, I think the easiest way to think about what AI can do for you is that it is not really artificial intelligence. It is automation. And if you think about it as automation, then it stops being magic, magical elves doing things for you. And it starts being, okay, if I could do this work, could it be automated, right? Can I automate the production of a paragraph? Can I automate the production of a sketch, an image, a video? Yes, you can automate those things. And the technique is what we call AI. But I still believe in an old axe I was given when I was in college, which is AI is what you call it before it works. And then when it works, you give it a name, like first order predicate logic or search or facial recognition or ChatGPT, right? Okay, sometimes they're bad names, but they get names. And when they get names, it's because it's useful and it works in the market. And you start thinking about what it does for you, not sort of in the wonky CS language, sort of stuff about what's happening behind the scenes.
So content intelligence we've been at for years. We've been injecting computer vision into processes for years. We've been doing document generation. Yeah. These are all, the stuff that Pega does with Next Best Action, with their, customer decision hub. These things are all deeply ensconced in AI technology.
There is pragmatic. But there is a difference, and I think this goes back to something that we talked about earlier, which is that if you apply AI to a model, then it's going to be constrained, it's going to be governed, it's going to be secure.
Right.
Whether a human builds something in the model or AI does. The problem is when you let it loose and you think, okay, I'm just going to go and have it do this process. Go back to the orchestration point. When you start orchestrating, you start building these the way they should be built today that weren't built before, then that's when I think AI becomes an accelerant for things like the model and low code, no code. And I think that's really where the void is. If you try to apply it to an existing application or something that was built, let's just say 10 years ago, but certainly 30, 40 years ago, I think you're in a world of danger zone there. That's my
agree. Hey, Scott, so co-founder of BP3, former CEO of BP3, now a board member. Right. So what now?
Well, I am in a really interesting transition in my life, right? I'm my oldest child, my daughter, is off to college. So this fall, my wife and I went with her to Spain and left her in school. She's going to school in Spain for the next 4 years, which is kind of an amazing opportunity.
Yeah.
And I have to say, the kind of thing that before I started BP3, I could not have imagined might be in my future for one of my children. And because of BP3, I was able to participate in the growth of a school in Austin called Magellan International School that does Spanish immersion. And so she's exited that school being fluent and literate in Spanish, as well as conversational in Mandarin. And so she's going well prepared into the world. But it was time for her to let her fly the nest, right? And okay, she flew a little farther than we might have imagined when she was born. But I feel like, for BP3, I'm at the same point, right? I'm 17 years in with BP3, 18 with my daughter, and BP3, I think, is ready to roll. And I have done my part to get it here. And this thing can, I think, evolve and grow and thrive without me. And I'm really excited for the next phase for BP3 because I feel like the market is kind of coming back to what BP3 is really strong with, which is process orchestration, doing the hard yards of work after requirements are done, right? Like not the early part of hey, should we solve this problem or not? Although we can help you with that, but we'll actually make sure you get delivered, you get to production, all the hard stuff that generally companies don't like doing. BP3 is really culturally and capability wise well suited to deliver.
Well, I worked with you guys at Pega, and you guys had a great reputation out there for what you delivered, and it's been great working with you. And Spain ain't that far away, and it's a fantastic place to visit. So,
So maybe one more question: Where in Spain?
Sure.
Spain's a big place,
right? So she's in Segovia, which is 30 minutes north of Madrid. So quick train ride up from Madrid. It's a beautiful city. I don't know if you've been to Segovia, but to give you a sense, she's got an apartment that costs less than any apartment you could get in Austin, and it has a view of the Plaza Mayor in Segovia and the cathedral. I mean, it's sure a lot better than the dorm room I had when I was a freshman.
Scott, thank you so much for your insights. As
Absolutely.
always, you've been at this for a long time, and you learned a lot, and obviously you brought a lot of value to the market during the course of that time. Yeah. So thank you so much for taking the time to share that with our guests.
Well, if I could just say one thing, Rob, you guys have been really fantastic for our industry, both of you, and your thought leadership, your willingness to come to conferences and communicate that thought leadership and talk to customers and vendors and consulting companies like BP3. I just really appreciate the leadership you guys have both shown in this business, and it means a lot. So it's really gratifying to be on air with you guys.
We always have these, I call them the Sally Field moments, because, I retired, Francis retired, John retired, and then, people are listening to the podcast and they're saying things like that. And I get the teary Sally Field. You like us. You really, really like us. So it's a great note to close out on. Thank you, everybody. And we'll see you next week on the next.
See you next time. Thanks again, Scott.
All righty.
Cheers.